Avoidants don't cheat because they found someone better. They cheat because they can't face themselves. Avoidant cheating is almost never about passion, temptation, or the excitement of someone new. It isn't driven by the thrill of the chase or the idea that they've discovered a better match. It's driven by something far more internal, something rooted in their deepest, oldest emotional wounds. To an avoidant, cheating becomes an escape hatch when intimacy begins to feel suffocating, when connection feels too real, or when the fear of being truly known becomes overwhelming. They cheat not to add something new to their life, but to avoid confronting what already exists within them. When closeness exposes cracks in their emotional armor, they don't move toward fixing them. They run, they flee, not from you, but from themselves. Avoidants often struggle to reconcile wanting love with fearing it. They crave connection, yet fear dependence. They want closeness, yet feel threatened by it. So when they sense themselves becoming vulnerable, their nervous system interprets it as danger. Instead of communicating fear, they create distance. Instead of asking for space, they subconsciously sabotage the relationship. And cheating becomes one of the most extreme ways to create that distance without having to directly confront the emotional intensity of the bond. It isn't logical, it's survival mode, a distorted attempt to regain control when connection feels too real. For avoidance, cheating doesn't start with desire for someone else. It starts with fear of needing you. The fear that you can hurt them. The fear that you can see the parts of them they've spent their entire lives suppressing. The fear that genuine intimacy will expose their insecurities, their emotional limitations, and their internal chaos. So they find an escape route, not a replacement. The act itself becomes a psychological buffer, a way to tell themselves, see, I'm not that attached. I'm still in control, but control is an illusion. Cheating doesn't prove independence. It reveals emotional avoidance at its peak. This type of cheating is not planned, rational, or even fully conscious. Avoidance can dissociate from their own feelings so deeply that cheating becomes a misguided attempt to relieve emotional pressure they don't know how to articulate. Once it happens, they often don't feel guilt in the way you expect. They feel confusion, emotional shutdown, or denial. Guilt requires emotional presence, something avoidants struggle with when they're overwhelmed. But here's the truth, they never anticipate. Cheating might create temporary distance, but it also plants the seed of long-term consequences. Because once their partner starts pulling away, once your warmth fades, your energy changes, your presence quiets, the avoidant begins to feel the one thing they spent their life trying to avoid, the weight of their own choices. The realization that the escape route they took didn't protect them, it cost them the only safe connection they had. They cheat to run, not to win. But in running, they lose the one person who ever made staying feel possible. For most people, cheating is a clear act of betrayal, a violation of trust, intimacy, and emotional safety. But for an avoidant, the meaning is twisted by their own internal wiring. They don't cheat because they want to replace you or because they've suddenly stopped caring. They cheat because they feel overwhelmed by closeness yet terrified of abandonment. This creates a psychological paradox inside them. They want love, but they can't handle the intensity that comes with being loved. Cheating becomes their dysfunctional attempt to restore emotional distance when the relationship feels too close, too vulnerable, or too real. To the avoidant mind, intimacy can feel like pressure. Not because the partner is doing anything wrong, but because vulnerability threatens the fragile emotional walls they've spent their entire life defending. When they sense expectations rising, when they feel emotionally exposed, or when they fear the growing possibility of disappointment, their instinct is to pull away. Not with a conversation, not with honesty, but with self-sabotage. And cheating becomes the quickest, most extreme method of creating space, without having to verbalize their discomfort. This is why the avoidant rarely sees their cheating as a betrayal of you. Instead, they frame it as a way to breathe, a way to reclaim autonomy, or a way to momentarily step outside the emotional intensity they feel incapable of managing. It doesn't excuse the behavior, but it explains the emotional logic behind it. To them, cheating is not about emotional connection with someone new. It's about interrupting the emotional connection that feels too intense with the person they truly care about. It's not about gaining something. It's about avoiding something. What makes avoidant cheating so confusing is the duality they live in. They fear intimacy, but they also fear being left. They don't want you too close, but they don't want you gone. They crave your presence. Yet they panic when they feel dependent on it. This internal conflict creates a pressure cooker effect. And instead of expressing what they feel, because vulnerability feels like danger, they unconsciously create situations that create distance for them. Cheating becomes this twisted buffer zone between connection and fear, a temporary escape that gives their nervous system space, but also fractures the very relationship that holds them together. It's an emotional paradox. The act they use to protect themselves ends up threatening the one thing they're most afraid of losing. After cheating, the avoidant often compartmentalizes. They push the act into a mental box, distancing themselves from the emotional meaning of what happened. They may appear indifferent or unaffected, not because they don't care, but because acknowledging the hurt they caused would require facing emotions they've spent years avoiding. But the distance they create always comes with consequences. Because the moment their partner withdraws, the moment you stop trying, the moment the emotional safety they took for granted begins to fade. That's when the avoidant realizes the distance they created wasn't a relief. It was the beginning of loss. To them, cheating was a way to avoid closeness. To you, it was betrayal. And the painful truth is that both are true. Avoidants carry a wound that is older than any relationship they enter. The fear of dependence. To them, depending on someone feels like losing control. It feels like exposing the very vulnerability they've spent a lifetime trying to protect. So when an avoidant begins to genuinely attach to someone, when they feel themselves softening, opening, relying, trusting, it doesn't feel safe. It feels dangerous. Their nervous system interprets closeness as a threat, not because the partner is unsafe, but because vulnerability reminds them of the emotional scars they never healed. And the moment they sense they might actually need someone, their instincts shift into sabotage mode. This is where cheating enters the picture, not as a search for something better, not as proof they've lost interest, but as a desperate attempt to break the growing emotional dependency. They cheat to convince themselves they're not too attached. They cheat to create emotional distance without having to admit that they're overwhelmed. They cheat not because they don't value the relationship, but because valuing it too much terrifies them. In their twisted logic, cheating becomes a way of regaining control, a way of reminding themselves that they're still independent even though their actions contradict their deeper truth. Avoidants hate the idea of being emotionally reliant on someone, even when that person brings them comfort, stability, and security. So when they catch themselves thinking about you too much, caring too deeply, or feeling too connected, a quiet panic starts to build. They fear that needing you gives you the power to hurt them. They fear that dependence means weakness. They fear that love makes them vulnerable to abandonment, the very thing they've always tried to outrun. Instead of leaning into connection, they pull away. Instead of communicating, they disconnect. And cheating becomes the most extreme form of self-sabotage, a symbolic way to remind themselves that their emotional world is still under their control, even when it isn't. They don't cheat to replace you because deep down, they know you can't be replaced. They cheat to dilute their feelings for you, to reduce the attachment that scares them. But this is where the emotional irony hits hardest. The fact that they need to sabotage the connection proves exactly how attached they truly are. If they didn't care, they wouldn't panic. If they weren't attached, they wouldn't fear losing themselves in the relationship. The cheating is not proof of indifference, it's proof of fear. But the avoidant doesn't realize that sabotaging the bond doesn't erase their feelings, it erodes the foundation of the relationship. Their attempt to avoid needing you eventually pushes you away. And once you detach, once you stop fighting for the connection, the avoidant is left facing the truth. They tried to escape, they didn't cheat to stop needing you. They cheated because they already did. Avoidants don't cheat because the relationship is failing or because the person in front of them is inadequate. They cheat when the emotional intensity of the connection becomes too real, too close, and too demanding for their nervous system to handle. Love itself triggers their survival instincts. The very closeness that most people crave feels like pressure, like a threat, like a trap. And because they are wired to avoid vulnerability, their brain flips into fight or flight mode. For them, cheating isn't a moral decision. It's an unconscious reaction, a way to escape the emotional heat without having to verbalize it. When intimacy rises, the avoidant feels it as an internal alarm. Thoughts like I'm being too exposed or I'm losing control start to dominate. They feel cornered by connection and vulnerable to disappointment, rejection, or emotional dependency. Instead of expressing these fears or trying to navigate them with honesty, they find shortcuts. They distract. They compartmentalize. They emotionally distance themselves through actions that create a buffer between their internal chaos and the intensity of love. Cheating becomes the extreme version of that buffer, a panic button pressed when they feel suffocated by closeness. This is why avoidants often leave partners baffled. You might think everything is fine, you might believe your relationship is healthy and growing, yet the avoidant's inner world is racing, calculating, and panicking. It's not about you. It's about their survival instinct kicking in before intimacy becomes too much. Cheating for them is a way to step back, regain emotional breathing room, and reassure themselves that they are not entirely dependent on anyone. In their mind, it's protection, not punishment, not malice. Ironically, the deeper the connection, the more likely an avoidant is to cheat. When a partner shows unwavering care, consistency, and emotional availability, instead of feeling safe, the avoidant feels exposed. The closeness highlights their fear of needing someone. It forces them to confront the very thing they dread, that they are entwined, emotionally invested, and vulnerable. And the closer the love feels, the more urgent the escape becomes. Cheating is the misguided shortcut they use to create distance without having to admit, I feel too much and I don't know how to handle it. This explains why avoidants often seem calm after being caught. There's no dramatic guilt, no public confession. They compartmentalize their behavior, mentally isolating the act from the emotional consequences. They often don't understand the magnitude of what they've done in terms of emotional betrayal because to them the act was a survival response, not a moral failure. In reality, the cheating doesn't solve the problem. It only exposes the avoidant's inability to tolerate closeness and highlights the vulnerability they are trying to escape. The relationship is still intact, yet emotionally, the avoidant has already taken a step back. Cheating is their panic button. It's the moment they hit pause on love itself, not because the connection feels wrong, but because it feels too real. Avoidants are paradoxical in the way they love. At their core, they fear conflict, emotional confrontation, and the responsibility that comes with expressing their feelings. They don't want to hurt you, at least not consciously. They genuinely care, but the very act of being honest feels like a threat to their emotional equilibrium. So instead of communicating discomfort, frustration, or fear, they find indirect ways to create distance. They hope that by subtly withdrawing, by acting distant, or by creating emotional friction, you will naturally pull away. They believe this will minimize direct pain, but in reality, it amplifies it. Cheating becomes one of the most extreme manifestations of this indirect approach. When facing a situation that feels emotionally overwhelming, avoidants don't break up. They don't have the tools to say, I feel trapped, I'm struggling. Instead, they take the shortcut of self-sabotage, creating a scenario that removes them from emotional responsibility. Cheating allows them to escape the intensity of connection without confronting it head-on. They tell themselves it's safer, easier, less confrontational, when in truth, it's destructive. The act is less about desire for someone else and more about running from the weight of their own emotions, which they can't manage or articulate. The cruelty of this pattern lies in its unintentional irony. They fear causing you pain, yet the very act they use to protect themselves causes the deepest hurt. It's a self-destructive loop. The harder they try to avoid emotional responsibility, the greater the damage to the person they claim to care for. Avoidants are trapped by their own coping mechanisms. They want emotional safety, and their first instinct is to preserve it, even if it comes at the cost of your heart. Cheating, in their minds, creates distance without confrontation, but in reality, it cuts the deepest because it is a betrayal of trust, intimacy, and the unspoken promise of security you gave them. What makes this even more devastating is that avoidants rarely process the emotional weight of their actions immediately. Their minds compartmentalize the guilt, the confusion, and the fear of loss, creating a mental space where they can function without collapsing under the emotional consequences. To them, it's a temporary solution, a pause button on closeness. But for you, the pain is immediate, raw, and unforgettable. You experience the act in its full emotional intensity, while they experience it as a protective shield against emotional overload. In truth, avoidants cheat because they cannot bear the tension of intimacy, but they also cannot bear the thought of being alone. They are caught in a liminal space between attachment and avoidance. Their fear of hurting you manifests in the worst possible way, through a betrayal that is indirect yet profoundly damaging. Cheating becomes their way to cope with a problem they cannot articulate, but it also becomes the very act that exposes the depth of their avoidance. Ultimately, they cheat to protect themselves from discomfort, yet the one thing they fail to see is that their actions hurt the one person they claim to care about the most, turning fear of harm into actual heartbreak. When an avoidant cheats, the world doesn't immediately collapse for them the way it does for their partner. Unlike those who process emotions through reflection, remorse, or confrontation, avoidants take a different route. They compartmentalize, constantly box up the act, separating it from the feelings it should evoke. The cheating becomes a functional event rather than a moral or emotional one. They disconnect not because they are heartless, but because feeling the full weight of what they've done would be too destabilizing. Their survival mechanism demands it. They must shut off the emotional meaning to continue functioning in their day-to-day life. This is why avoidants often appear calm, detached, or even indifferent after being caught. It's not that they don't care about the pain they've caused, they do, but they don't have the tools to process it in a conventional way. Their inner world is too fragile to handle the collision of guilt, regret, and shame all at once. Instead, they retreat into confusion as if trying to puzzle out a problem they don't have the vocabulary to describe. They might wonder, why did I do this? Or what does this even mean about me? Without fully connecting those questions to the emotional consequences their partner feels. Their focus is on self-preservation, not self-punishment. Avoidants struggle to sit with discomfort. They struggle to face their mistakes because mistakes feel like exposure of flaws, exposure of vulnerability, exposure of the parts of themselves they have spent a lifetime hiding. Cheating, therefore, becomes another act that requires emotional dissociation. They can acknowledge the behavior cognitively, but the emotional meaning remains distant, buffered by a wall of mental compartmentalization. This allows them to continue functioning, to navigate daily life, and to maintain a semblance of stability even as the relational damage unfolds. Ironically, this emotional confusion can make avoidance seem even more impenetrable. Partners may expect anger, tears, or immediate remorse, but instead encounter silence, detachment, or ambiguous reactions. It feels like callousness, but it's really a coping mechanism. Avoidants are not indifferent to loss, but they do not process emotional information the way most people do. They are trying to protect themselves from a reality that is too raw, too complex, and too threatening. In truth, the confusion they feel is a reflection of their inner conflict. They acted to escape emotional intensity, yet they remain attached to the very person they tried to distance themselves from. They acted out of fear, yet the fear itself becomes confusing when confronted with the reality of loss or the consequences of their actions. The guilt never arrives in the expected form. Instead, it hides behind questions, disorientation, and a subtle recognition that the life they attempted to protect has been altered. Cheating in an avoidance world is therefore less about immorality and more about survival. And in that survival, they feel not guilt, not shame, but confusion, the murky emotional aftermath of an act they committed to avoid feeling too much. Avoidants rarely experience immediate regret after cheating. The act itself is, in their mind, a calculated escape, a way to regain space from emotional intensity, rather than a moral failure. In the moment, they compartmentalize their actions, detach from the emotional consequences, and convince themselves that distance is the solution, not loss. Their nervous system doesn't allow them to feel the full emotional impact while the connection still exists, because closeness itself triggers fear and pressure. But your absence is the mirror that forces the truth into their awareness. When you begin to withdraw, when your energy, presence, and attention no longer revolve around them, the avoidant experiences a reality check, unlike any other. Your silence is sharper than any argument, colder than any confrontation, and heavier than any expression of hurt. It's in that vacuum of connection that they finally feel the weight of what they've done. They didn't process your needs or your feelings when they betrayed you, but your absence forces them, confront the consequences they tried so hard to ignore. Suddenly, the emotional buffer they created collapses, and the reality of their actions hits them with full force. This is why avoidance can seem oblivious for weeks, months, or even years after a betrayal until your withdrawal becomes undeniable. They often don't process loss in real time because doing so would require them to sit with feelings they've spent a lifetime avoiding: vulnerability, dependence, and emotional exposure. But when the person who made them feel truly seen is no longer trying, their carefully constructed detachment falters. Regret emerges not from moral reflection, but from the visceral experience of scarcity, the realization that the connection they sabotaged cannot simply be restored by words or excuses. The painful irony is that avoidants often misread their own feelings. In the absence of your presence, they may feel anxiety, longing, or emptiness and mistake it for freedom, independence, or even relief, until the realization dawns that what they truly miss is the emotional security and validation you provided. They didn't cheat because you weren't enough, but they often discover too late that no one else can provide the unique depth of understanding and emotional resonance they once had with you. Your absence becomes a mirror reflecting everything they lost, not just a partner, but the safe emotional container they secretly relied on. Avoidants rarely articulate this realization. They internalize it, ruminate on it, and quietly struggle with the emotional consequences of the very actions they once thought would protect them. This is why their regret is delayed, subtle, and often misunderstood. They don't experience immediate guilt because survival instincts kept the emotional floodgates closed, but absence, your silence, your detachment, your decision to stop fighting for them finally breaks through their defenses. Ultimately, avoidants only truly regret cheating when they feel the void they created, when they sense the loss of the very person who once anchored their emotional world, and by then, the lesson is often irreversible. Distance, once felt, teaches more than confrontation ever could. Cheating might feel like an act of control for an avoidant, a way to regain space and preserve independence, but in reality, it sets the stage for their own emotional unraveling. Avoidants rely on subtle forms of stability, anchors they often fail to acknowledge, and the person they betray is frequently the very anchor that keeps their internal world balanced. Your presence, consistency, and emotional availability provide a container that allows them to navigate intimacy without fully collapsing under its intensity. When they cheat, they unwittingly dismantle that container. The security they've taken for granted is no longer guaranteed, and their carefully maintained balance begins to crumble. At the moment of detachment, when you pull back in response to betrayal, the avoidant experiences something they rarely admit: panic. They may have thought cheating would give them freedom, but instead it creates absence, silence, and distance. The person who once soothed their fear, who tolerated their walls, who met them where they were emotionally, is suddenly no longer there to buffer their insecurity, and avoidants are left to confront what they have long avoided: themselves, their emotions, and the consequences of their actions. The cheat that was intended to protect them from emotional pressure ends up being the very thing that destabilizes their world. This is where the avoidance paradox becomes most visible. In seeking temporary relief from closeness, they destroy the one relationship that could have offered a sustainable form of intimacy. They lose the emotional safety net they relied on, often unconsciously, and are forced to face a reality they cannot easily control. Unlike others who might process regret and repair relationships in real time, avoidants process it slowly, often in silence, and only after the absence has been deeply felt. What begins as an act of avoidance transforms into a confrontation with their own loss. The betrayal is double-edged. Not only have they hurt the person they supposedly care for, but they have also betrayed their own emotional needs. The stability, understanding, and acceptance that once existed in the relationship cannot simply be replaced. No other connection can instantly provide the same level of emotional resonance and security. The avoidant may try to distract themselves, rationalize their actions, or compartmentalize the guilt, but nothing can fully restore what was lost through the very act meant to preserve freedom. In essence, cheating becomes the avoidant, self-inflicted downfall. By attempting to avoid emotional intensity, they accelerate a loss that they were never truly prepared to endure. The absence you create after betrayal is the ultimate teacher, highlighting not only their miscalculation, but also the cost of trying to outrun intimacy. The cheating wasn't merely a betrayal of you, it was a betrayal of the only connection capable of keeping their emotional world grounded. And in that downfall, the truth becomes unavoidable. The moment they sought distance, they lost the very safety they relied on, and no amount of freedom or avoidance can replace what has been broken. Avoidants often believe that cheating grants them control, emotional breathing room, or even temporary relief from intimacy. After the act, they may try to convince themselves that they are unaffected. They may throw themselves into distractions, work, or fleeting connections to avoid the heavy weight of their own actions. They may even pretend that the person they betrayed was easily replaceable, that love is interchangeable, or that attachment is expendable. But reality has a way of breaking through these defenses, slowly, subtly, and relentlessly. The truth hits hardest in the quiet moments, when the distractions fade and the temporary escapes lose their novelty. It's in the emptiness of a room, the absence of a familiar voice, the silence where once there was connection. That's when the avoidant begins to realize what they truly lost. No one can replicate the unique bond you shared with them, the emotional depth, the understanding, or the safety that you provided. They may have tried to cheat to regain distance, to avoid needing you, or to assert independence, but what they thought they could escape becomes painfully irreplaceable. This recognition is their true punishment. It isn't legal consequences, confrontations, or social judgment that shake them. It's the internal awareness that they have fractured the one relationship capable of giving them emotional security. The person they once depended on, even subconsciously, for stability and comfort, is no longer fully present. Their attempts at moving on quickly are futile because the heart cannot be replaced and the emotional resonance you provided cannot be duplicated. The echoes of your absence reverberate louder than any justification or rationalization they construct. The irony is piercing. They didn't cheat because you weren't enough. You were, and often still are, everything they needed. They cheated because they weren't ready, not ready to handle the closeness, the vulnerability, or the dependency that true connection requires. Their timing, their fear, and their avoidance dictated the betrayal. Yet the realization comes too late. By the time the awareness sets in, you have either withdrawn emotionally or established boundaries that cannot easily be undone. They are forced to confront the consequences of their own emotional unpreparedness. In essence, avoidants punish themselves in the very way they cannot articulate. The emptiness left by your absence is more severe than any argument, more instructive than any confrontation, and more unavoidable than any distraction. They are left with the truth. Their attempt to escape intimacy did not liberate them. It deprived them of the one person who understood, tolerated, and loved them in a way no one else could. The cheating was not a reflection of your shortcomings. It was a reflection of their internal limits. And so their greatest lesson is this: no act of avoidance can replace genuine connection. The person they tried to distance themselves from remains irreplaceable. They cheated to run, but in the end, they are the ones left facing the absence, realizing that what they lost cannot be recovered.